Hello and welcome to this special editorial video. I'm BrySkye, and to mark the start of Shark Week 2014, I'd like to talk a little bit about sharks and how they've been portrayed in video games. Now, first things first, I'm not really a fan of what Shark Week has become since the turn of the century. Rather than education, the programming is increasingly focused on the kind of sensationalism that made Jaws the first summer blockbuster back in the 70s. By far its primary focus is to generate ratings, which has led to an increasing amount of fictional entertainment shows masquerading as documentaries and using pseudoscience. But I digress. Let's get to the games. Sharks have been used countless times in video games as enemies or obstacles. This isn't very surprising when you consider that Jaws was released in 1975, a mere 2 years before the legendary Atari 2600. And the year after that, Jaws 2 was released to theatres. Essentially, both sharks and video games were thrust into mainstream culture at about the same time. Jaws utterly terrified people, and, to this day, sharks tap into a part of the human psyche that unsettles us, make them an easy and, to be quite honest, obvious threat in our virtual worlds. Let's have a closer look at what I consider some standout examples of sharks in gaming. First up, let's consider an angle beyond that of human and shark interactions. And we can do that with the Echo the Dolphin series, which made its debut on the Sega Mega Drive back in 1992. Funnily enough, despite the game's premise of starring a dolphin and navigating the world's seas, sharks are by no means the most dangerous animals encountered, although by the end of the game they are perhaps some of the most numerous. For the most part, they do not actively pursue Echo, instead being patrolling obstacles that inflict damage if touched. Though there are notable exceptions, such as during the open ocean stage and some of the later levels. Nonetheless, dolphins are very much a part of the ocean's food chain, and even the most devout shark lovers must surely be prepared to accept that sharks showing aggression towards Echo is not unreasonable. This aggression was increased significantly when Echo made his 3D debut on the Sega Dreamcast, although this footage was recorded from the PlayStation 2 version, which has proper 16:9 widescreen support and a slightly more stable frame rate. In Echo the Dolphin, Defender of the Future, sharks are a very serious threat in the early portions of the game, but perhaps most memorable is the boss battle against a large great white shark. I'll go quiet now so you can fully enjoy this cutscene narrated by Tom Baker.
By reclaiming the stolen globes, Echo reopened the time vortex. The dolphins of the past were ignorant of what had been stolen from them. And unaware that their descendants would be denied the golden age. But when intelligence and ambition were returned to them, dolphins changed. And history was altered. But Echo's world was not restored. Dolphins became aggressive and forced humans from the seas, never to return. And dolphins built a new reality. Creating a nightmare of their own.
Ultimately, sharks are just a natural part of a dolphin's world. While sharks do indeed prey on dolphins when given the opportunity, we also know that groups of dolphins have also harassed and killed sharks. When all is said and done, the biggest threats in the Echo games are their puzzles, the very design of the levels, and a limited air supply. Now for something a bit more obscure, a PC game with the rather creative title of Shark, Hunting the Great White. Yes, it's a hunting game, with the twist of being set underwater. The goal is incredibly simple: destroy all sharks. This is going to be our low point of this roundup, since that really is the premise of the entire game. There is some underwater exploration to be done in order to unlock new equipment, but this is a game you could quite easily 100% within an hour. Although this looks like a poor Dreamcast game, it was in fact released in 2001. Still, it's worth a mention because of its mechanics. Although it might not have been the developer's intention, this is really quite a terrifying game in its own way. This is a first-person game with visibility that's worse than the original Turok, combined with the prospect of being attacked from any direction. On top of that, it features a proximity warning in the form of your increasingly loud and rapid heartbeat as a shark nears. It's simple, but this game manages to capture the aspects of sharks and the ocean in general, which terrify us the most. And then you see the absolutely awful renderings of the sharks and are reminded that it's hard to be afraid of graphics this bad. Also of note is the game's final hunt, which features the Megalodon itself as a surprise. This was really at the cusp before the Megalodon exploded into popular culture, so that's a bit of an interesting detail. Moving on, Tomb Raider is definitely worth a mention here. Unfortunately, this isn't a series I'm very familiar with. I've only played through Crystal Dynamics' Tomb Raider Legend and its follow-up, Tomb Raider Anniversary. Nonetheless, I did purchase Tomb Raider Underworld in order to capture this footage while we talk about the series. Great white sharks have made appearances in Tomb Raider 2, as well as its expansion, the Golden Mask, while Tomb Raider 4 features great hammerhead sharks. Rather more interesting, in my opinion anyway, is Tomb Raider Underworld, which features these really quite well rendered blue sharks, although their animations leave quite a bit to be desired. Blue sharks can be identified not just by their colour, but their long noses and pectoral fins. They are found pretty much everywhere except for the Arctic and Antarctic, though they are rarely encountered by swimmers due to their preference for open waters. Later on, the game also features Greenland sharks, and while I've not gotten that far, I've checked some other videos on YouTube and they are rather less impressive. But we'll get to Greenland sharks in more detail a little bit later on. Personally, I would say these blue sharks are excessively aggressive. The species tends to be quite wary, although their curiosity can overcome this fairly quickly in large groups. Now, we definitely can't forget to mention Crysis, in this case the port for the Xbox 360 using CryEngine 3. The sharks of Crysis became one of the earlier YouTube fads as they were not only located outside of the typical game space, but also because they had a huge amount of health, were incredibly lethal, and were prone to some crazy glitches to feed people's nightmares. In other words, flying sharks. Before Mega Shark vs Giant Octopus and Sharknado made the idea itself a joke. The Crysis sharks are modelled on great whites, although I personally think they look more like a great white and mako hybrid. Shark nerds will probably be aware of the broad-toothed mako shark, which the great white is believed to be descended from. These sharks exist purely to punish players for exploring too far beyond the game's intended boundaries, but in a far more memorable way than an invisible wall or the rockets from those warships. You have to appreciate the way they ominously and calmly circle the player before abruptly deciding to attack. Upon seeing one of these sharks, it's quite possible to escape if you immediately swim back towards shore. Strangely, the whole sequence is actually animation based. Once the shark begins its attack animation, then death is inevitable, regardless of the player's ability to evade. And this is Jaws Unleashed. Okay, let's clear this up right away. This is not a game to be taken very seriously. It's very silly and ridiculously over the top, and I don't just mean watching 10 or so minutes of anything that moves being chewed up. This great white shark is an eco-warrior that puts Captain Planet to shame, destroying oil rigs, refineries and underwater mining operations that are chewing up all sea life. It's crazy. But despite that, the people at Appaloosa Interactive, who also happen to make Echo the Dolphin Defender of the Future, still try to put in an explanation for the game's events.
And new partnerships with corporations such as Environ Plus will allow us to open our doors to even more visitors.
Our research clearly indicates the subsonic frequencies used by Shaw's underwater seaseeker machines are having a dramatic effect on the local shark population. It's causing them to approach human settlements and to become increasingly more violent.
Listen, Brody, I don't know what they taught you in those institutions where you studied, but you're beginning to sound like your dad, you crying wolf. Environ Plus is bringing in millions to our community. The machines stay. The Amity Shark Tournament begins tomorrow, and odds are they will catch the shark before anything else happens.
Now, I actually don't believe this game is anywhere near as bad as people make it out to be. Play the PC version, but make sure to use a controller. I was using an Xbox One controller while recording all of this, and it works great. In terms of gameplay, camera, etc., this game really is superior to the 3D Echo game in every way. Be sure to try the different camera modes as well. Camera 2 is the most effective from a gameplay perspective. Camera 1 is really more for cinematic effect. As the game's tagline stated, you are the shark, so many of your actions are in your own hands. This is Grand Theft Auto, where you play as a great white. Speaking of Grand Theft Auto, that's another game series where sharks have been a part of its mythos. While sharks did appear in Vice City, they were completely harmless, invincible, and even unanimated. While these assets were still present in San Andreas, it's apparently not conclusive if they can be encountered in actual gameplay. GTA 5 changed all of this. The scope of that game cannot be understated with the addition of a submersible and scuba diving. Sharks are here and they are no longer just for show. Their primary function, like Crisis, is a means of preventing player progress beyond the realms of the map. Those that are encountered at designated locations closer to shore are actually quite interesting from an AI standpoint. While recording this video, I spent a good 10 or so minutes scuba diving with this particular shark, which showed no overt aggression, provided I kept facing it. It would actually swim away from me and, at a certain distance, it would effectively switch off and become completely stationary in the water until I swam closer. However, once I turned my back on it for any amount of time, it would begin stalking me, which ultimately ended in an attack. Very interesting in my opinion. As for the model itself, I wouldn't say it's particularly well rendered. I can only imagine it is supposed to be a great white, albeit very stocky and, well, fat, with a lack of distinctive markings. If it weren't for the size and completely black eyes, I would actually be more tempted to say it's meant to be a bull shark. Ah, bull sharks. Let's segue straight into Far Cry 3 and Assassin's Creed 4. In both games, bull sharks are the only actively threatening species to the player. While Black Flag does feature great hammerheads and great whites, they are only encountered in the harpooning minigame and so are not really a direct threat to the player under normal circumstances. Hell, the great whites in Assassin's Creed 4 are completely docile until you stick a whacking great big sharp piece of metal into them. So quite understandable really, and the very definition of provoked attack.
Hold fast! Hold tight, lads! Good hit, Captain! Stung him! He's got free! Any sighting? Secure, Captain! That's right! Tire yourself out! You see that, lads? He's gone! Heading at us! Larboard bow! Steady now, lads! Success! Success! He's got free! Can't win this, Captain! You did it, Captain! Alright! Alright! Yeah!
Bull sharks are another matter though, as this is the only species that's encountered while swimming in both games. Far Cry 3's bull sharks are very aggressive towards swimmers under most circumstances, although it is possible to swim amongst them without triggering an attack if you keep your distance and try not to swim directly in front of them or near the surface. But the message is clear, swimming in Far Cry 3 is very risky business. However, it's worth pointing out that sharks are far from the only dangerous wildlife in that game. Truth be told, bull sharks are one of the least dangerous animals in Far Cry 3. The main problem comes from your inability to defend yourself while in the water. Anyone who's played Far Cry 3 will be able to tell you that bears or tigers are much more dangerous. The bull sharks of Black Flag, on the other hand, are a much more serious threat. They are larger and their AI is incredibly aggressive. The main reason for this is simply to make navigating the diving sections of the game more difficult and adding some tension. To introduce a sense of danger where there otherwise wouldn't be. They do this by forcing the player to try and be stealthy while underwater, sticking to seaweed and shipwrecks which provide shelter from the sharks, but also ensures that you have to keep a close eye on how much air you have left.
Dead ahead! Got him, Captain! Here we go! Finish him off, sir!
One of the things I found quite odd about Assassin's Creed 4 was that despite the Caribbean setting, there are absolutely no tiger sharks whatsoever. Tiger sharks would have definitely been a more appropriate species compared to the great white. But this is likely to be the Jaws effect creeping in. This is another game where sharks are not particularly singled out. As far as the harpooning missions go, orcas, humpback and sperm whales are also targets.
There he is! Starboard bow! Secure the rope! Hold tight, lads! Give it the iron, one more time! Watch it! The tail! He don't like that! The beast is dead!
All right.
Yeah. Heading at us! Larboard bow! Yes, he's done for!
All right.
He's a monster!
There is no way to attack the bull sharks in the diving sections. The lesson is very simple: avoid them. To be honest, that really isn't a bad moral. But let's end on a more positive note, and we can do that with Endless Ocean 2: Adventures of the Deep for the Nintendo Wii. In this case captured from the Dolphin emulator for more visual punch. The original Endless Ocean was released in 2007 to a rather mixed reception. There was even debate about whether or not it was actually a video game. With its complete lack of danger and the casual, even optional progress of its story mode, some felt that it epitomised the trend for non-games on the Wii. Well, that's a bit silly really, and 7 years later we see a lot more games like this and don't really think much of it anymore. The first game featured quite a few sharks and, regardless of species, they were all completely harmless. Even Magutapa, a massive and incredibly well rendered great white shark that was meant to represent a god of violence and death. I would show you some footage of Magutapa, but I no longer have the original game for my Wii, and while I did contact Zorak and the chaps at An Orbital Grouse via email and Twitter, they never replied. Since I lack any permission from them, you're not seeing any clips from their videos here. Which is a shame, as it's quite amusing watching a badly rendered Bear Grylls being attacked by an even worse looking tiger shark. Anyway, Endless Ocean 2 was released in 2010 as a vastly more expanded product. Everything was executed to a far higher standard, and believe me, I played this game to death. It was actually released just a few days after I broke my left elbow, which required surgery to repair. So for the better part of 3 weeks, I really couldn't play any games at all except for Endless Ocean 2, which could be completely played with my one good arm thanks to the Wii remote. Unlike its predecessor, Endless Ocean 2 allowed some animals to behave in an aggressive manner towards the player. Death and physical injury is still impossible. The only victim is your air supply, reducing your dive time as a punishment for getting too close to an animal that deserves your respect. All of the sharks in the game which display aggression, those being the great white, tiger, Greenland, blunt-nosed sixgill and goblin sharks, will instead slap the player with their tails. All of these aggressive sharks in the game can be calmed with a device called the pulsar, which, through the magic of electromagnetism, can also heal animals. There is but one exception to this. Meet Thanatos, named for the Greek personification of death and one of the game's dozen legendary creatures. Thanatos is a repurposing of the Magutapa 3D model from the first game, with some alterations such as the elongated fins and tail that make him look different from any real great white. He cannot be calmed, and a tail slap from this monster will drain twice as much air as any other creature in the game. He also has a backstory which pulls no punches in stating that he is a man-eater, the only time the game uses the term. Within the game, it is theorised that Thanatos is a response from sharks and Mother Nature herself, its existence being a punishment for the exploitation of the oceans by humans. Nonetheless, even Thanatos does not pursue the player over any length of distance to attack. All of the dangerous animals in the game only attack when you swim too close, rather than actively hunting the player. To me, this is very reasonable. While I think sharks are amazing animals and far from ruthless killing machines, I also believe they deserve our respect, and interfering with them should be kept to a minimum. We may see lots of footage and photos these days of people hugging sharks, putting them into tonic immobility, or overloading their senses by rubbing their noses with gloves made of stainless steel rings. But that does not mean we should ever completely drop our guard around them. No matter how unlikely an attack may be, and regardless of its motivation, it is always a possibility. Even the most careful nip from a shark in curiosity or as a tiny warning can cause a serious injury to us. With the media being as sensationalist as it is, let's try not to give them any excuses. Above all else, never forget to give sharks, or any wild animal for that matter, our utmost respect. Right, that's it from me. Thanks for watching, and enjoy the sharks.